The morning of August 31st, 1943, aboard the aircraft carrier USS Yorktown, somewhere in the Central Pacific, Lieutenant Commander Edward Butch O'Hare stood on the flight deck watching mechanics pre-flight a new fighter he'd never seen in combat, the Grumman F6F Hellcat. Bigger than the Wildcat he'd been flying, heavier, more powerful. The pilots had heard rumors. This plane was supposed to change everything in the war against Japan. But standing there, watching the morning sun glint off its stubby wings, O'Hare felt the same knot of tension he'd carried since 1942. The Japanese Zero still owned the sky when it came to turning fights. American pilots had learned to survive by refusing to dogfight, by using the thatch weave, by throttling down to force overshoots. Defensive tactics that kept you alive but didn't win wars. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. What nobody knew yet, standing on that carrier deck in the last days of summer 1943, was that American fighter pilots were about to discover something that would transform every lesson learned over Guadalcanal and Midway. Not just how to survive against Zeros, but how to dominate them. And it would start with a maneuver that violated every instinct trained into pilots since flight school. Barrel rolling into a dive when an enemy was on your tail. By August 1943, American naval aviation had traveled a brutal education in aerial combat. The lessons began on December 7, 1941, when Japanese aircraft destroyed most of America's Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. The Zeros that escorted those bombers weren't just good fighters. They were revolutionary. Mitsubishi had built an aircraft that could turn inside anything the United States possessed, that could climb faster, that had range measured in thousands of miles rather than hundreds. The statistics from early 1942 painted a grim picture. At Darwin, Australia, 9 Zeros shot down 4 P-40 Warhawks without a single loss. Over the Philippines, Japanese fighters massacred American air power on the ground and in the air. The F6F Wildcat, America's primary carrier fighter, was outclassed in almost every measurable way. The Zero completed a full 360-degree turn in roughly 16 seconds. The Wildcat needed 19. Those 3 seconds meant death, but American pilots learned. Lieutenant Commander Jimmy Thatch spent his nights aboard the Lexington in early 1942, pushing matchsticks around his desk, trying to solve an impossible problem. How do you fight when you can't turn with your opponent? His answer became the thatch weave, 2 aircraft flying parallel courses, turning toward each other in a scissoring pattern. When a Zero attacked one plane, the other would cross in front with guns blazing. The Japanese pilot had to choose between pressing his attack and flying into certain death, or breaking off and losing his advantage. The weave worked. At Midway on June 4, 1942, Thatch's division used the maneuver to shoot down multiple Zeros and protect their torpedo bombers. But it was purely defensive. You couldn't win a war by weaving and hoping the enemy made mistakes. You needed to attack, to take the initiative, to turn defense into offense. And that required tools the Wildcat simply didn't possess. Enter the throttle-down technique. Desperate pilots discovered that chopping power to idle when a Zero was closing for a kill could create an overshoot. The Zero's momentum would carry it past the American fighter, transforming Predator into prey for the 2 or 3 seconds before the geometry collapsed. It was a trick that worked exactly once per engagement, and only if you timed it perfectly. But it kept pilots alive long enough to learn other lessons. By mid-1943, American fighter tactics had evolved into a doctrine based on energy management. Stay high, stay fast. Dive on the enemy, take a shot, and zoom back to altitude before the Zeros could react. Captain Joe Foss described it bluntly during a November 1942 debriefing. The Zero wants you to turn. That's his game. So don't play it. Stay above him, stay fast, hit him when he's not looking, and get out before he can respond. This boom and zoom approach worked, but it required extraordinary discipline. Every instinct screamed at you to pull around for another shot after the first diving pass. But that turn bled off speed, surrendered your energy advantage, and put you into the Zero's world. Pilots who couldn't resist that temptation died. Those who maintained discipline survived. The kill ratios gradually shifted in America's favor, but survival wasn't victory. The problem was that energy fighting was inherently conservative. You could dictate when to engage, but once engaged, your options remained limited. Dive, shoot, climb. Repeat. If a Zero got on your tail despite your altitude advantage, you were back to defensive maneuvers, the weave or the throttle down trick. You couldn't counterattack effectively because the moment you started maneuvering, the Zero's superior turning ability gave it the advantage. Grumman Aircraft Corporation had been working on a solution since 1941. The F6F prototype first flew on June 26, 1942, but the design underwent significant changes after combat reports from the Pacific filtered back to Long Island. Engineers interviewed pilots like Butch O'Hare, asking them exactly what they needed to beat the Zero. The answer wasn't subtle: more speed, more power, more firepower, better protection. Everything the Wildcat lacked. The final F6F3 design incorporated a Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine producing 2,000 horsepower, nearly double the Wildcat's output. That power pushed the Hellcat to 391 miles per hour in level flight, 60 miles per hour faster than either the Wildcat or the Zero. 6 50 caliber machine guns in the wings with 2,400 rounds of ammunition. Heavy armor behind the pilot's seat, around the oil tank, and a bullet-resistant windscreen. Self-sealing fuel tanks that wouldn't explode when hit. But the Hellcat's most important advantage wasn't in the specifications. It was in the structural strength. Grumman had built an airframe that could handle sustained high-G maneuvers without coming apart. The wings were thick, stubby, massively reinforced. The fuselage was built like a beer barrel, thick-skinned and robust. This wasn't elegant engineering like the Spitfire's elliptical wings or the Mustang's laminar flow design. This was brute force engineering. Build it strong enough that a pilot could throw it around the sky without worrying about overstressing the airframe. The first, Hellcats, reached combat squadrons in February 1943, but it took months to work through the logistics of replacing Wildcats throughout the fleet. By August, enough Hellcats were operational that pilots could start pushing the aircraft's limits in actual combat, and what they discovered changed everything. The Hellcat's power and structural strength created new possibilities. You could dive faster than a Zero and pull out harder. You could roll faster. You could sustain higher G-forces in turns without the aircraft shaking itself apart. Most importantly, you could transition between maneuvers more aggressively than any previous American fighter. That flexibility opened up tactical options that simply didn't exist with the Wildcat. Lieutenant Richard May of Fighting Squadron 5 flew one of the first combat missions in a Hellcat on August 31, 1943, during raids on Marcus Island. His division encountered Zeros at 18,000 feet. May initiated a standard boom and zoom attack, diving from altitude onto a Zero that hadn't seen him coming. He fired a 2-second burst that tore through the Zero's unarmored fuselage. The Japanese fighter rolled inverted and fell away trailing smoke. But instead of the usual climb back to altitude, May did something different. Another Zero had seen the attack and was turning to intercept. Rather than running away, May pulled up sharply, then rolled into a barrel roll while still climbing. The maneuver displaced his flight path laterally, forcing the pursuing Zero to adjust its attack angle. By the time May completed the roll, he'd gained altitude and position. The Zero pilot broke off, unwilling to commit to a geometry that had suddenly turned unfavorable. May landed back on Yorktown with a new understanding. The Hellcat could fight in 3 dimensions in ways the Wildcat never could. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. You weren't limited to horizontal or vertical maneuvers. You could combine them, rolling while pulling, creating complex flight paths that were nearly impossible to track or predict. More importantly, you could do this while maintaining enough energy to either continue the fight or disengage cleanly. Other pilots reported similar experiences. The Hellcat didn't turn as tightly as a Zero at low speed. Nobody disputed that. But at medium to high speeds, with altitude and energy to work with, the Hellcat could maneuver aggressively enough that the Zero's turning advantage became irrelevant. Japanese pilots who expected American fighters to run away after an attack suddenly faced opponents who would reverse, roll, and come back at them from unexpected angles. The real breakthrough came from an unlikely source: defensive emergencies that forced pilots to try things they'd never attempted before. Lieutenant J.G. Walter Framingham of Fighting Squadron 9 found himself in exactly such a situation on September 19, 1943, during operations near Tarawa. A Zero had gotten on at his tail, somehow, despite all the altitude discipline and situation awareness drilled into him during training. Framingham's first instinct was the throttle down technique, but something stopped him. The Hellcat had power and structural strength the Wildcat lacked. Maybe there was another way. He pulled back hard on the stick while simultaneously rolling left and cutting throttle. The combined maneuver, a high G barrel roll that killed forward speed while drastically changing his flight path, created something the Zero pilot had never encountered before. The Zero overshot, but not in the clean, linear way a throttle down produced. Framingham's barrel roll had displaced him laterally and vertically. The Zero flashed past, 30 feet away and 15 feet low. Framingham shoved his throttle forward, the massive double Wasp engine responding with a surge of power that pulled him through the rest of the roll. He came out level, slightly nose high, with the Zero hanging in front of him, at low speed and terrible position. Framingham fired a 3-second burst. The Zero's right wing separated from the fuselage. The aircraft tumbled into the ocean. Framingham's hands were shaking when he landed, not from fear, but from the realization of what had just happened. He'd turned a defensive emergency into an offensive opportunity, using nothing but the Hellcat's raw performance and structural strength. Word spread through the squadron that night. Framingham described the maneuver in detail during debriefing. Pull hard, roll hard, cut throttle at the right moment, use the displacement to create an overshoot, then convert back to offense before the enemy could recover. Other pilots wanted to try it, but the squadron commander, Lieutenant Commander Philip Torrey, shut down the enthusiasm immediately. This was a last-ditch maneuver, Torrey emphasized. You used it when everything else had already failed, when a Zero had beaten your altitude advantage and defensive weave, when you were out of options except dying or trying something desperate. Because the high G barrel roll bled energy catastrophically. If you missed your shot, if the Zero didn't overshoot cleanly, you'd be slow and vulnerable with no energy reserve. It was trading your last chips for one chance at turning the tables. But Torrey recognized the potential. The Hellcat could execute maneuvers that would tear a Wildcat apart. That opened new tactical possibilities, particularly in the transition between defense and offense. The key was understanding when and how to use these capabilities without surrendering the energy advantages that kept you alive in the first place. Over the next 3 months, as more Hellcat squadrons deployed throughout the Pacific, pilots experimented with aggressive defensive maneuvers. The high G barrel roll became one tool in an expanding toolkit. So did the rolling scissors, where 2 aircraft would climb vertically while barrel rolling, each trying to pull their nose, through the top faster than their opponent. The Hellcat's power-to-weight ratio and structural strength gave it advantages in these vertical fights that the Zero couldn't match. The Japanese noticed interrogations of captured pilots in late 1943 revealed growing respect and caution regarding American fighters. One Zero pilot, shot down over Rabaul in November and pulled from the water by an American destroyer, told interrogators that American tactics had become unpredictable. The fighters no longer ran away after one attack. They maneuvered in ways that were difficult to counter. Engaging them had become dangerous, even when Japanese pilots held positional advantage. By December 1943, the Hellcat had largely replaced the Wildcat aboard fleet carriers. The transition brought more than just better aircraft. It brought a fundamental shift in American fighter doctrine. The purely defensive posture of early 1942, the weaving and running and throttling down, had evolved into something more aggressive. American pilots still used energy tactics as their primary approach, still maintained altitude and speed discipline, still refused to turn fight zeros at low speed. But now, when circumstances forced close combat, they had options. They could fight their way out instead of just surviving. They could transition from defense to offense, using the Hellcat's power and strength to create opportunities where none had existed before. And most importantly, they could make mistakes, take hits, absorb damage, and still bring their aircraft home. The Hellcat was built like a tank. It could take punishment that would down a zero instantly. The statistics reflected this transformation. In the last 3 months of 1943, Hellcat squadrons achieved kill ratios exceeding 5-1 against Japanese aircraft. Not just zeros, but bombers, reconnaissance planes, float planes, everything the Japanese threw at them, and these weren't veteran pilots with years of experience. Many were recent graduates of the new Replacement Air Group training program, arriving in theatre with perhaps 200 hours of flight time. What made the difference was systematic training in the new tactics. The Navy had institutionalized the lessons learned over Guadalcanal and Midway. Student pilots trained in Hellcats from day one, learning the aircraft's capabilities and limitations before ever seeing combat. They practiced energy management, boom and zoom attacks, the thatch weave, and emergency defensive maneuvers, including the high G barrel roll. Instructors emphasized that the barrel roll was not a standard combat maneuver. It was an emergency procedure, used when you'd already failed at everything else. But knowing it existed, having practiced it during training, gave pilots confidence. If a zero got on your tail, you weren't helpless. You had one more card to play. And if you played it right, you could turn imminent death into a confirmed kill. Lieutenant Commander David McCampbell, who would become the Navy's leading ace with 34 victories, all in the Hellcat, described the aircraft's capability this way during a January 1944 interview. The Hellcat isn't trying to be a zero. It's not going to outturn one at low speed. But it doesn't need to. We fight our way, using our advantages: speed, firepower, structural strength, armor. When we're forced into close combat, the Hellcat can maneuver hard enough to create opportunities. That's all you need. One opportunity, one good shot. By early 1944, the cumulative effect of better aircraft, better tactics, and systematic training had shifted the balance in the Pacific decisively. Japanese naval aviation was bleeding experienced pilots faster than training programs could replace them. The Americans, meanwhile, were producing hundreds of well-trained pilots and thousands of Hellcats. The industrial and educational entry systems were gearing up for the massive offensives planned for summer 1944. The Japanese still had veteran pilots, still had capable aircraft, still could mount dangerous operations. But the initiative had shifted. American carriers operated with confidence, launching strikes deep into Japanese-held territory. Fighter sweeps destroyed Japanese aircraft on the ground and in the air. And when Japanese fighters rose to meet them, Hellcat pilots had the tools and training to dominate the engagements. The evolution of American fighter tactics from defensive survival in 1942 to aggressive dominance by 1944 wasn't about a single breakthrough. It was about systematic improvement. Each battle taught lessons. Each lesson was analyzed, codified, and transmitted to new pilots. The thatch weave gave way to energy fighting. Energy fighting incorporated aggressive defensive maneuvers, every element built on what came before, and throughout this evolution, one constant remained. American pilots adapted faster than their opponents. When the Japanese developed counters to the thatch weave, American pilots shifted to boom and zoom attacks. When zeros learned to avoid being bounced from above, Americans added the high-G barrel roll and rolling scissors to transition from defense back to offense. Every time the Japanese adjusted, Americans found a new approach. This adaptability was structural, built into how the American military operated. Combat veterans rotated home to train new pilots, transferring knowledge directly. After-action reports were analyzed systematically and distributed fleet-wide. Mistakes were studied as carefully as successes. The entire system was designed to learn, adapt, and improve continuously. The Japanese had no equivalent system. Their best pilots stayed in combat until they died. When they died, their knowledge died with them. Replacement pilots received abbreviated training because Japan lacked fuel, time, and safe airspace for comprehensive instruction. By early 1944, many Japanese pilots arrived at frontline units with less than 100 hours of total flight time. They were flying the same Zeros that had dominated in 1942, but without the skill to exploit the aircraft's capabilities. American pilots, meanwhile, were better trained, better equipped, and tactically more sophisticated than at any previous point in the war. They flew Hellcats that could absorb damage, maneuver aggressively, and deliver devastating firepower. And they were about to face the ultimate test of these advantages in the largest carrier battle of the Pacific War. The stage was set for the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, where everything American pilots had learned since Pearl Harbor would collide with the last major effort of Japanese naval aviation. And in that collision, the barrel roll and all the other hard-won tactical innovations would prove their worth in the most one-sided aerial slaughter of World War II. June 19, 1944. The Philippine Sea, west of the Mariana Islands. Admiral Mark Mitcher's Task Force 58 floated in formation, 15 fleet carriers and hundreds of supporting vessels screening the American invasion of Saipan. Intelligence reports indicated a massive Japanese carrier force approaching from the west. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa commanded 9 carriers with approximately 450 aircraft. He was coming to fight the decisive battle that Japanese naval doctrine had anticipated since the war began. American radar picked up the first incoming raid at 10:15 in the morning. Fighter direction officers aboard the carriers began vectoring Hellcats into position. Lieutenant Junior Grade Alex Vraciu, already an ace with 13 kills, sat in his cockpit aboard the Lexington when the order came to launch. 12 Hellcats took off, climbing hard to 25,000 feet on a heading of 250 degrees. The Japanese attack consisted of 69 aircraft, mainly Zero fighters and Judy dive bombers. They were flying at lower altitude, around 15,000 feet, headed directly for the American carriers. Vraciu's division had perfect position. Altitude advantage, sun behind them, approaching from an angle the Japanese weren't watching. This was the setup every fighter pilot dreamed about. But what happened next demonstrated how completely American tactical doctrine had evolved. Vraciu led his division into a diving attack, picking up speed quickly. His Hellcat hit 400 miles per hour in the dive. At this speed, the Zero escorts had virtually no time to react. Vraciu selected a Judy bomber, lined up his gun sight, and fired a 2-second burst from 300 yards. The bomber's right engine exploded. The aircraft rolled inverted and fell away. Vraciu pulled up hard, converting his diving speed back into altitude. But he didn't climb back to 25,000 feet and set up for another patient diving attack. Instead, he spotted another group of Judies at 14,000 feet, trying to reach the carriers. Rather than making a pure vertical zoom climb, Vraciu rolled into a climbing barrel roll, displacing his flight path laterally while still gaining altitude. The maneuver put him on a different attack angle, one the Japanese hadn't anticipated. He leveled out at 17,000 feet, now positioned perfectly for another diving attack. This was the new doctrine in action. Use energy tactics as the primary approach, but add 3-dimensional maneuvering to create multiple attack opportunities without surrendering your energy advantage. The barrel roll wasn't just a defensive last-ditch maneuver anymore, Pilots had learned to use variations of it offensively, to reposition quickly while maintaining altitude and speed. Wraciew dove again, destroying a second Judy, then a third, then a fourth, fifth, and sixth, all in roughly 8 minutes of continuous combat. His gun camera would later show that he'd used only 360 rounds out of the 2,400 available. Precise, disciplined shooting combined with perfect positioning. When Wraciew landed back on Lexington, he held up 6 fingers for the deck crew. 6 kills in one mission. Admiral Mitcher congratulated him personally, but Wraciew's performance, remarkable as it was, represented just one tiny slice of what was happening across the entire battle space. American fighters had intercepted all 4 Japanese raids that day. The results were catastrophic for Japanese naval aviation. Of the 69 aircraft in the first raid, only 27 returned to their carriers. The second raid of 128 aircraft lost 97. The third raid of 47 planes lost 7. The fourth raid of 82 aircraft encountered such fierce resistance that most turned back without ever reaching the American carriers. The American pilots had multiple advantages working in their favor. Radar gave them early warning and allowed fighter direction officers to vector Hellcats to optimal intercept positions. The Hellcats themselves were faster, more heavily armed, and far more durable than the Japanese aircraft. American pilots were better trained and tactically more sophisticated, and the Japanese were making fundamental mistakes. Japanese naval aviation in June 1944 was a shadow of what it had been in December 1941. The veteran pilots who'd attacked Pearl Harbor, who'd dominated the early Pacific War, were mostly dead. Their replacements had abbreviated training and limited combat experience. Many had never made a carrier landing at night. Some had less than 100 hours of total flight time. They were flying obsolete Zeros against pilots in Hellcats who'd been systematically trained in tactics specifically designed to exploit the Zero's weaknesses. The tactical execution on June 19th demonstrated how completely American doctrine had evolved. Hellcat pilots maintained altitude discipline, diving on Japanese formations from above. They used the thatch weave when multiple enemies threatened their formations, with wingmen crossing paths to create interlocking fields of fire. They employed boom and zoom attacks, hitting hard and climbing away before the Zeros could react. And when Japanese fighters managed to achieve firing positions, American pilots used aggressive defensive maneuvers that had been refined over 2 years of combat. The high G barrel roll forced overshoots. Rolling scissors in the vertical dimension exploited the Hellcat's superior power. Even the old throttle-down technique still worked against inexperienced pilots who couldn't adapt when their target suddenly decelerated. But the most important factor was confidence. American pilots knew their aircraft could take punishment. They knew their tactics worked. They knew they had advantages in almost every category that mattered. That confidence translated into aggressive flying that kept the Japanese constantly defensive. Zero pilots who'd expected to bounce American fighters instead found themselves being bounced, surrounded, overwhelmed. The anti-aircraft guns from American ships added to the slaughter. The fleet had been arranged in a defensive formation with battleships on the outer ring, their 5-inch guns creating a wall of flak that Japanese aircraft had to penetrate to reach the carriers. Many didn't make it. The combination of fighters and anti-aircraft fire created multiple layers of defense that the Japanese simply couldn't overcome. By the end of June 19th, the Japanese had lost approximately 380 aircraft. The Americans lost 23 Hellcats in air combat. The kill ratio exceeded 16-1 for the day. American pilots, watching the one-sided massacre, started comparing it to shooting turkeys. One pilot remarked it was like an old-time turkey shoot back home. The nickname stuck, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. But the battle wasn't over. On June 20th, American search planes finally located the retreating Japanese carriers. Admiral Mitcher launched a massive strike, 216 aircraft, even though the range meant his pilots would have to land after dark. something most had never done. The strike sank the carrier Hio, damaged Zuikaku and several other ships, and destroyed another 65 Japanese aircraft. The mission cost the Americans 80 aircraft, but most of those losses were from running out of fuel or ditching during night landings, not from enemy action. The Battle of the Philippine Sea effectively destroyed Japanese naval aviation as an offensive force. Between the 2 days of fighting, Japan lost approximately 600 aircraft and several carriers. More importantly, they lost hundreds of pilots, including many of the remaining veterans. Japanese naval aviation never recovered. Every subsequent battle showed declining Japanese capability as pilot quality continued to deteriorate. The 19-to-1 kill ratio that Hellcat pilots achieved across the entire Pacific War had its roots in this moment. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot represented the culmination of American tactical evolution from 1942 through 1944. Everything learned through blood over Guadalcanal, refined during the Solomon Islands campaign, and perfected during the Marshall Islands operations, came together in one massive demonstration of air superiority. The barrel roll, both as a defensive emergency maneuver and as an offensive repositioning tool, played its part in this victory. Not every pilot used it. Not every engagement required it. But its availability, the knowledge that you could maneuver aggressively in 3 dimensions when circumstances demanded, gave American pilots flexibility that Japanese pilots lacked. You weren't limited to turning fights or vertical fights. You could combine elements from both, creating complex flight paths that exploited the Hellcat's strengths while minimizing its weaknesses. Lieutenant Commander Paul Buey, an ace who flew throughout the Pacific campaign, described the tactical philosophy this way during a post-war interview. We learned to think in 3 dimensions, not just forward and back, not just up and down, but rolling and displacing our flight path to create angles and opportunities. The Hellcat let us do that because it was strong enough to handle the stress and powerful enough to maintain energy through aggressive maneuvers. The Zero could turn tighter in 2 dimensions, but we owned the 3rd dimension. The aftermath of the Philippine Sea battle rippled through both sides. For the Americans, it confirmed that their aircraft, training, and tactics had achieved decisive superiority. Carrier task forces operated with confidence, launching strikes deep into Japanese territory. Fighter sweeps destroyed Japanese air power on the ground and in the air. The advance toward Japan accelerated. For the Japanese, the battle marked the end of conventional carrier warfare. They could no longer contest American carrier operations. Future battles would see the Japanese increasingly reliant on land-based aircraft, shore defenses, and eventually kamikaze tactics. The myth of the invincible Zero, already badly tarnished by mid-1943, was completely shattered. But understanding why the 19-to-1 kill ratio happened requires looking beyond the Battle of the Philippine Sea. The ratio represented the cumulative effect of every American advantage working together. Better aircraft, better training, better tactics, better logistics, better intelligence, better industrial production, better institutional learning. Every element reinforced the others. The Hellcat was faster than the Zero, more heavily armed, better protected, and structurally stronger. But these advantages meant nothing without pilots trained to exploit them. American pilot training by 1944 was comprehensive and systematic. Student pilots spent months learning their aircraft, practicing tactics, flying hundreds of hours before ever seeing combat. They trained in the actual aircraft they'd fly in combat, not obsolete trainers. They learned from instructors who were combat veterans, who passed on lessons learned through actual experience. Japanese pilot training, by contrast, had collapsed. The Japanese couldn't afford the fuel for extended training. They didn't have safe airspace where students could practice without risk of attack. They didn't rotate combat veterans home to teach. The training programs that had produced the elite pilots of early 1942 were gone, replaced by abbreviated courses that sent inadequately prepared pilots into combat against vastly superior opposition. Tactics mattered enormously. American fighter doctrine had evolved through systematic analysis of combat results. After-action reports were studied carefully. Successful techniques were codified and taught to new pilots. Unsuccessful approaches were abandoned. The entire system was designed to learn and adapt continuously. Every battle made the next one more effective. The thatch weave, energy fighting, boom and zoom attacks, throttle down overshoots, high G barrel rolls, rolling scissors, these weren't random innovations. They were carefully developed responses to specific tactical problems, refined through practice, validated through combat, and systematically transmitted to new pilots. By 1944, every Hellcat pilot graduating from training knew these techniques. They'd practiced them repeatedly. They understood when and how to use each one. Japanese tactics, meanwhile, had stagnated. The doctrine that worked in 1942, emphasizing the Zero's turning ability and the skill of elite pilots, remained essentially unchanged. But the conditions that made those tactics effective had disappeared. The elite pilots were dead. American aircraft had evolved beyond what the Zero could effectively counter. And American pilots had learned not to fight the Zero's fight. The barrel roll's evolution from desperate defensive maneuver to standard tactical tool exemplified this American adaptation. In early 1943, it was something you tried when everything else had failed. By mid-1944, pilots understood it as one option among many, useful in specific situations but not a magic solution. The high G barrel roll worked best when you had some energy reserve, when the pursuing aircraft was close enough that your displacement would force an overshoot, and when you could execute it precisely enough to avoid departing controlled flight. Instructors taught students the physics behind the maneuver. When you pull hard while rolling, you're creating a helical flight path. Your aircraft moves laterally and vertically while bleeding forward speed. The lateral displacement breaks the pursuing pilot's aim. The altitude change complicates his attack geometry. The speed loss forces him to either throttle back or overshoot. If he follows you into the maneuver without perfect coordination, he'll either stall or overshoot or lose sight of you. Any of those outcomes gives you an opportunity to reverse the situation. But the instructors emphasized that the maneuver cost energy. You couldn't just barrel roll your way through an entire fight. You used it at specific moments, when the tactical situation made it the best available option. Then you transitioned immediately back to offense, using whatever opportunity the maneuver had created. Hesitate, and the enemy would recover position. Press the advantage, and you could turn defense into a confirmed kill. The cumulative impact of these tactical innovations showed up in the statistics. In 1942, American fighters in the Pacific achieved rough parity with Japanese aircraft, sometimes slightly better, sometimes slightly worse depending on circumstances. By 1943, the ratio had improved to 3 or 4 to 1 in America's favor. By 1944, it reached 10 to 1. By war's end, Hellcat pilots had shot down 5,216 enemy aircraft while losing approximately 270 Hellcats in air combat, 19 to 1. But numbers don't capture the human element. Japanese pilots flying Zeros in 1944 faced an impossible situation. They were inadequately trained, flying obsolete aircraft, against superior opposition using tactics specifically designed to counter the Zero's strengths. Every mission was suicide. Some missions they knew they wouldn't return from before they even took off. American pilots, meanwhile, operated with the confidence that comes from systematic superiority. They knew their aircraft was better. They knew their training was better. They knew their tactics worked. That confidence translated into aggressive flying that compounded Japanese problems. A confident pilot takes risks, presses attacks, maintains initiative. A desperate pilot makes mistakes. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot represented the peak of American carrier aviation's dominance, But the systematic advantages that produced the 19-to-1 kill ratio persisted through the rest of the war. At Leyte Gulf in October 1944, Hellcats again dominated Japanese aircraft. During the invasions of Iwo Jima and Okinawa in 1945, American fighters maintained complete air superiority despite fierce kamikaze attacks. The barrel roll and other aggressive defensive maneuvers remained relevant throughout, though their use became less common as Japanese fighter opposition declined. By late 1944, most American fighters encountered kamikaze aircraft rather than fighters. Kamikazes didn't dogfight, they just tried to crash into ships. American pilots shifted from air-to-air combat to interception, shooting down suicide aircraft before they could reach their targets. But the doctrinal lessons remained. American fighter tactics developed during World War II influenced jet combat in Korea and Vietnam. Energy management, boom and zoom attacks, aggressive defensive maneuvering, these concepts transferred directly to faster aircraft and different circumstances. The fundamental principles remained valid even as technology evolved. The F-86 Sabre pilots who fought MiG-15 seconds over Korea used energy tactics derived from Pacific War experience. They understood that their aircraft couldn't turn with the MiG at slow speeds, so they avoided those fights. They used speed and vertical maneuvering to dictate engagement terms. When MiGs got advantageous positions, Sabre pilots used aggressive defensive maneuvers to create overshoots and reversals. The specific techniques adapted to jet performance, but the underlying tactical philosophy remained unchanged. Vietnam initially saw the Air Force and Navy forgetting some of these lessons. Early F-4 Phantom tactics emphasized beyond visual range missile shots. When those missiles proved unreliable and rules of engagement required visual identification, Phantom pilots found themselves in turning fights with nimble MiG-17 seconds. The results were poor. American pilots were trying to turn-fight aircraft that could outturn them, repeating the same mistakes Wildcat pilots had made in early 1942. The creation of Top Gun and similar fighter weapons schools represented a return to the systematic tactical development that characterized American naval aviation in World War II. Instructors taught energy management, aggressive defensive maneuvering, and the importance of fighting your way rather than the enemy's way. Kill ratios improved dramatically after Top Gun graduates deployed to Vietnam. The lessons of 1942 through 1944 remained relevant 30 years later. Modern fighter combat looks nothing like World War II dogfights. Beyond visual range missiles, stealth technology, and networked sensors have transformed air warfare. But the fundamental principles endure: maintain energy advantage, dictate engagement terms. Fight your way, not the enemy's way. When forced defensive, maneuver aggressively to create opportunities for reversal. These concepts, refined over Guadalcanal and proven in the Philippine Sea, remain valid in fifth-generation fighter combat. The barrel roll's journey from desperate emergency technique to standard tactical maneuver to historical footnote demonstrates how military innovation works. Desperate circumstances force creative solutions. Some solutions work better than others. The successful ones get refined, practiced, systematized, and transmitted to new pilots. The specific technique becomes less important than the underlying principle it represents. In the case of the barrel roll, the principle was simple but revolutionary for its time. Don't limit yourself to two-dimensional thinking. Use all three dimensions of the battle space. Exploit your aircraft's strengths, even in defensive situations. Turn defense into offense at the earliest opportunity. These ideas seem obvious now, but in 1943 they represented the cutting edge of fighter tactics. The 19-to-1 kill ratio wasn't about magic maneuvers or wonder weapons. It was about systematic excellence across every element of air warfare. The Hellcat was an excellent aircraft, but so was the Zero in 1942. The difference wasn't the aircraft. It was everything surrounding the aircraft. Training, tactics, logistics, leadership, institutional learning, adaptability, and the industrial capacity to produce overwhelming numbers of aircraft and pilots. American naval aviation in 1944 represented a mature system operating at peak effectiveness. Every component reinforced the others. Excellent aircraft gave pilots confidence to execute aggressive tactics. Systematic training ensured pilots knew how to use those tactics effectively. Combat experience refined the tactics continuously. Institutional learning captured lessons and transmitted them to new pilots. Industrial production provided enough aircraft that losses could be absorbed and replaced. Intelligence operations gave tactical advantage through radar and code breaking. Even logistics mattered, ensuring carriers stayed on station with adequate fuel, ammunition, and spare parts. Japanese naval aviation, by contrast, had collapsed across multiple dimensions simultaneously. Pilot quality declined catastrophically after Midway. Industrial production couldn't keep pace with losses. Logistics struggled to support forward operations. Training programs couldn't produce adequately prepared pilots. Intelligence failed repeatedly. Tactics stagnated. Aircraft development lagged. Every element degraded at once, creating a cascading failure that the Japanese could never reverse. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot was simply the most visible manifestation of these underlying realities. American systematic excellence versus Japanese systemic collapse. The 19-to-1 kill ratio quantified the gap, but the numbers alone don't explain why that gap existed. Understanding the why requires examining every element of the system, from how pilots were trained, to how tactics were developed, to how aircraft were maintained, to how intelligence was gathered and used. The barrel roll and other aggressive defensive maneuvers played their part in achieving air superiority, but they were never the primary factor. The primary factors were strategic, systemic, institutional, better training systems, better tactical development processes, better logistics, better intelligence, better industrial production. The barrel roll mattered because it gave individual pilots one more tool, one more option, when things went wrong. But the real victory came from ensuring things rarely went wrong in the first place. By war's end, the Hellcat had become the most successful aircraft in naval aviation history. 12,275 produced. 5,216 enemy aircraft destroyed. 19-to-1 kill ratio, more fighter aces than any other American aircraft. These numbers represented more than just successful aircraft design. They represented the maturation of American naval aviation into the most effective air combat force in the world. The pilots who flew Hellcats in the Pacific went home after the war and became flight instructors, airline pilots, test pilots, engineers. They transmitted their knowledge and experience to the next generation. The tactics they'd developed continued evolving through Korea, Vietnam, and beyond. The principles they'd proven in combat remained valid even as technology advanced beyond anything they could have imagined in 1944. Lieutenant Commander Jimmy Thatch, who started the tactical revolution with his matchsticks and weave-in early 1942, retired as an admiral. His tactical innovations influenced fighter doctrine for decades. Captain David McCampbell, the Navy's leading ace with 34 kills, became a role model for generations of fighter pilots. Alex Vrasiu, who shot down 6 aircraft in one mission during the Turkey Shoot, lived to see his actions commemorated in museums and histories. These men didn't consider themselves heroes. They were doing their jobs, using the tools and training provided, following tactics that had been proven in combat. The barrel roll was just one technique among many, but their willingness to innovate, to try new approaches when old ones failed, to systematically learn from experience and transmit that knowledge to others, created the foundation for American air superiority that persisted long after they'd retired. The 19-to-1 kill ratio achieved by Hellcat pilots represented the culmination of American adaptation, innovation, and systematic excellence. From the desperate defensive tactics of early 1942 to the overwhelming dominance of mid-1944, American naval aviation transformed itself through continuous learning and improvement. The barrel roll into a dive was one small part of that transformation. But understanding its place in the larger tactical evolution reveals how systematic innovation defeats individual brilliance, how institutional learning compounds advantages over time, and how the side that adapts fastest usually wins. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.